So let's go ahead and take a breath, everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started. I see that everybody is joining us. We are so excited to be here today, and I will introduce myself as well as my co-presenter today. We are very excited to share some time with you. And as you can see, I am joined by my colleague, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. So first, I would like to just say that welcome everybody, as my moderator might have, but I will do so, to this MAMA colleague conversation. This is a series of virtual opportunities to share amongst ourselves issues that are popping up in your workplaces and museums and archives. So without much further ado, as for myself, my name is Sarah Buchanan. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Missouri, where I teach archival studies to Master of Library and Information Science students. And as part of my research, I am interested right now in issues related to provenance research. And I also study issues in other data collections, including audiovisual material and archaeology. So today I will be talking about my provenance research. And with that, I'd like to now turn it to my co-presenter, who is Jane Bartley, and she will introduce herself.
Yep, thank you. So my name's Jane Bartley. I'm a first-year graduate student in the MLIS program at Missouri. I have an engineering background that's focused in shipbuilding and augmented reality training solutions. And I'm currently serving as the GRA for this project with Dr. Buchanan. And I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen. Thumbs up, maybe.
I think we're good.
Okay. Was there anything else for you, Dr. B, before I hit the ground running?
No, well, obviously we'll both have come back in online. First, I'd like to have Jane get started with the next item.
Perfect. All right, so before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I really think we need to define what provenance is. You may be interested to know that the word provenance, like a lot of our words in English, it derives from one of the largest Romance languages, so French. The French verb provenir means to originate. So the SAA's definition of provenance states that it's information regarding the origins, custody, and ownership of an item or collection. So provenance isn't just related to our professional life. We actually use it in our personal day-to-day. The examples I always think of are purchasing a home or purchasing a car. If you've done any of those things, you've dealt with provenance. The concept of provenance also spans across disciplines. Often research on a work of art, for example, will begin by utilizing those art history resources. But as your research progresses, those art history resources can lead you to other things like genealogical or historical materials. Another key thing about provenance is it tells so much more about an object than just the pedigree. So let's say, again, you're performing provenance research related to a work of art. That research can provide insight on artist popularity, social and political alliances, market conditions. What you can discover during provenance research really is unlimited. So have you ever written the acquisition info element in a finding aid? If you have, you've actually completed provenance research. Large museums like the Met and the Getty also perform this type of research, and they make their work very visible. The key point here is that provenance research can be completed at large institutions, private research firms, or just by independent researchers. So now that we have an idea a little bit about what provenance is, I think we need to talk about why it's important. So provenance is important for a number of reasons, but I've highlighted what I like to call my big three here, which are ownership, authenticity, and then determination of value. So starting with ownership, at its core, provenance performs that detective work to determine the rightful owner of an object. So that established or complete, in this case, provenance is what provides the documentation for the ownership. Other supporting documents like a proof of sale can also help legitimize that even further. So the next one on my list is authenticity. So the provenance for an object helps provide the evidence to solidify that object's authenticity. Fortunately, forging and falsification of documents is a real issue, so oftentimes other evidence is needed besides that provenance. And then my last bullet here is on value determination. So depending on the situation, the value can range from monetary, so like the Antique Roadshow folks, to sentimental. So that established provenance can have a positive impact on the value of an object, but incomplete provenance can have the opposite effect because it can lead to questions about the object's authenticity. All right, so I know this slide looks like a lot of text, but I really do think it's important to understand why and how provenance research is becoming more of a priority. So first thing, behind everything we do, no matter the profession, there lies a code of ethics. Provenance research is no different, and it can be directly linked to the SAA's code of ethics, which I've listed here on the slide. So provenance allows us to be transparent about the objects in our collections, not only how we acquired them, but where they came from in the first place. This transparency is really important because it not only instills trust within each other in the field and the profession, but it lets our patrons instill trust in us. So on the slide, I've also highlighted 3 of the important laws in the American context related to provenance. These are by no means the only laws related to provenance, but they're a few of the relevant legal frameworks. The most recent one I have on this slide is the Washington Conference Principles of Nazi Confiscated Art. So this is a development of 11 principles, but it's also really what compelled museums like the Met and the Getty to make their provenance more accessible by launching those websites that you see today. All right, so I've introduced some of the key legal frameworks, and before we go into our project approach, I kind of wanted to give an example that you guys might have heard of in the form of a painting titled Eternos Caminantes, or the Eternal Wanderers. And this was painted by Lazar Segal in 1919. As part of the graduate program, the Pratt Institute completed multiple case studies that focused on Nazi looted artworks. They then used these really neat visualization techniques in the form of interactive story maps to really bring the artwork story to life. So in this example, the researchers used a software program that's called ArcGIS Story Maps. And I've included a screenshot here on this slide, but keep in mind, it is interactive. So if you go to the website, you actually click through the timeline of the piece of art, which is really neat. And something else that's really interesting to me about this example is how an object's journey can take it all over the world. So in this case, the painting, its origin is 1919 in Dresden City Museum, but then it ended its journey in 1958 at the Lazar Segal Museum, which is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But I do hope this example kind of helped visually show that provenance is not like just an abstract concept. It can be visualized, it can be touched, it can be interacted with. But now to broaden our look, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Buchanan, who's going to go further into our project and some of our early findings.
Yes, fabulous example there. I think as you saw on the very first slide, a little bit of how we're going through today is we're talking generally about the concept. Of course, we're providing a couple examples. And right now, I'll just go out one more level to talk about where does provenance fit in both the museum and the archival fields, as well as the kinds of objects that it can impact, which is a very broad range. As you see here, the scope of our project is uniquely broad. I'm particularly interested in the archival background for the issue of provenance because it has been so formative to the way that archivists process collections, and provenance is the key organizing principle for how we provide access to our collections. But that said, it affects not only archival and manuscript collections, but also, as you just saw with Jane's example, paintings, and even sculptures. And as you can see here in the table, any object that might be part of a comprehensive art collection that would collect in many different areas, regardless of time period or even format of the material. So our scope is broad, yes, and part of the reason for that that broad scope is that it allows us to draw both from the experiences of museum curators who investigate provenance in some small way, and also the experiences of archivists who are guided implicitly or otherwise by provenance in their day-to-day work. And we're drawing attention to provenance through our exploration of these three research questions. As you see here, we first look at the issue of how are we practicing provenance research, both in the museum and archival space. So now that we've just established its importance, and that even in some cases it's urgent to do this kind of work, we can then look more into how. How is it done, given that it's important and given that in some cases it's urgent. And here you might remember the movie Woman in Gold. Anybody saw that with Helen Mirren? I'd love to see in the chat, perhaps that rings a bell for anybody. In that case, we saw a little bit of the issue of urgency here, because the case at hand was a painting. And as you know, from World War II, we are encountering issues of people's memories fading, documentation getting lost, and crossing of borders for these objects as well as the people involved, all of which makes it very challenging to put the pieces back together. So I hope maybe some of you have heard of that movie. If not, I do recommend it. Next, you see also here that there's another question about which methods are best useful to expand public engagement with collections. In our work, we've talked with many people who do provenance research in different ways. So which methods are working for them? And finally, the third question relates to some insights that I've already gained from introducing the concept and the practice with some of my students who look at collections across our campus. And for example, we have looked at collections in both museums and in archives. So we are looking at, again, this issue of provenance research is not just done by specialists, but it's also done by any archivist who has a hand in writing a finding aid or contributors to that finding aid, all of whom should be cited by name in the finding aid, because it gives proper credit for that very useful work that they're doing. So imagine that you or I am an archivist and we're based in an art or history or even a science museum. Where do we start to find the provenance information for what we're calling today the Knotty collections? Those ones that have sat unprocessed for years because little transfer paperwork exists, perhaps. And some museums and institutions have not wanted to promote objects that might not be clear and free in title. IFAR, which is the International Foundation for Art Research that Jane mentioned on an earlier slide, recognized this in 2017 when they relaunched their provenance guide with a new Getting Started section. So people are starting to recognize that we need to know how to go about the topic. It also started to identify that, yes, there are the categories of art that might have been looted by the Nazis during World War II, and those may have different needs than, for example, antiquities, which also have different needs than perhaps Native American artifacts. And that gets at what you're seeing here in the table, is that there are definitely different categories that provenance affects, and they do all have different needs. So for reasons of time and scope, we won't be able to go into detail for all of these, but next I am going to provide an example from one of them. Certainly all three of these research questions underpin some of what you're hearing from us today, but next here's an example for the very first of the research questions. From the rural history collection setting, we encountered the example of trying to get to know your collection. In these settings, sometimes the collections can comprise multiple provenances, which scholars have written about. And it's not only that we are able to keep the collections distinct from one another by knowing that multiple provenances exist, but actually they serve to be more useful for the purposes of research that the institution supports by all being categorized as the same kind of object. You see this perhaps in categories of wings in a museum. When you visit a museum, they might have a Native American gallery, and that will include necklaces and clothing and beads and all sorts of different artifacts, but it gets at the issue of provenance. They share provenance, or they're from the same tribe perhaps, but there's also multiple levels within that perhaps we know the information to a point, but beyond that, we need to investigate and get to know a collection better. And this is what came out in this example. It's the process of uncovering messy information that has not explicitly been part of the cataloging workflows of the past. So that's why there's often a disconnect between what we see in an exhibit label, where an item will be numbered and it will indicate the source. But also if you compare that label to what's online in the catalog record, there might be more or less levels of information on the two sources. So this was interesting in that it requires outside time and requests to your systems librarian or your technical staff to update and to correct new information into the public access catalogs, which are different than what the staff might be working in, but they do contain roughly the same information. And I know this was a very small sliver of an example, but as you can see in the table on the right, in general, we are recognizing that what I said earlier, that different categories of art and museum objects do have different information needs. And what I've just presented was in the rural history setting, we're relying a lot on the paperwork, the documentation from a donor, the exhibit labels that might be out in public on the gallery space. It's useful to go visit the gallery yourself as a staff and see what are we saying about this object. There might be photographs taken at different stages of the object conservation, and those will have information on them too. So apart from the rural history setting, again, you can see that there are different levels of information for these different areas that we're looking at in this project. Next slide. Great. Next, in these next and final two slides, I would just like to summarize a few of the challenges that archivists in particular and other subject specialists related to museums face in completing provenance research on the collections under their care. So in these final two slides, here we recap the main challenges and then our emerging and very much ongoing responses to the challenges. The first that you see here is incomplete methodology. A lot of the available resources and methods for doing provenance research have taken a case study approach, often using very high profile objects to examine multiple and diverse sources of information for these objects, leaving a lot of the mundane or everyday objects behind, leaving archivists to wonder, where do I start with my Knotty collection? In the second bullet point, you see also the issue of a lack of standards. Jane and I have discussed a few times that the AAM guide to provenance research, as well as the IFAR guide, have a lot of virtues, and they provide a very solid foundation for introducing some places for where to start, but we do need some more detailed resources in addition to that. These resources, like the two here, can also be limited in focusing on art museum collections. And again, we wonder, where are the resources for archival materials? Third is the state of the surviving records associated with the object. Obviously, we've touched upon this with the impact of the Washington Principles in 1998, which at a congressional level recognized the urgency for establishing laws related to the restitution of World War II arts looted during World War II. For those reasons and for other records, the existing sources might have suffered damage or been dispersed, and also the records might not be available in the place we would expect them. And finally, is an unfortunate issue of falsification or fake provenance or forgeries. There are certain categories in our scope where this is more of an issue than others, for sure. But it's certainly something that affects art and museum collections broadly. Last slide. And here we'll just summarize by sharing a little bit of how we are meeting these challenges in our work. You can keep an eye on our project website, which is here. And there is where we will be sharing some of our emerging and in progress resources here. And in closing, I do want to open it up now. Fortunately, we're right on time. So thank you for your patience. By summarizing and thanking you for being here, and also thanking the IMLS for their support of this project, and of course, our interviewees who have contributed to its success as well. Thank you, everybody. So now you have come with questions and with issues that I see in the chat. So we can go back to the last slide there, or we can stop sharing our screen as well. And I'd like to ask if anybody would like to unmute and speak the questions that they have come up with. I'm glad that the Women in Gold movie has been seen amongst us today. I do recommend it. Chloe, I see that you had a question about some of the references we cited. Is there anything that we could discuss more? Happy to have a conversation.
Oh, I wanted to get a screenshot so I could look them up later.
Yes. Okay, we have a good question from in the chat. Is this a big research area in archival studies? So it's an interesting question, right? Because provenance has implicitly guided the work that archivists are doing and the ways that we instruct new archivists and the manuals and procedures that we can find online related to collections management for collections. And provenance has been a part of those conversations for a century at least. So I think that by focusing our attention on the how-to and the methods of provenance research, we are surfacing some of those implicit processes that maybe haven't been articulate and spelled out in certain ways. But I'd love to hear you define, big research area a little bit more, if you would. I will also add that people look at the concept of provenance in very creative ways as well. We recognize in this project that it is part of the normative structure of how we provide access to collections through finding aids and metadata standards such as EAD. In fact, when Jane mentioned the acquisition info element, some of you might say, ah, yes, that's from EAD 2002. Obviously, we are constantly evolving in our metadata use, and standards are now up to EAD 3. But it's part of the, like I said, the everyday process of arranging and describing our collections. And then given that it's so formative to those collection descriptions, people are also looking at provenance in more creative ways. For example, recognizing that multiple provenances in the case of Native American artifacts can actually reveal that different tribes might approach their collections in very different ways. And I've written about that some, happy to talk about that more. And the issue of verifiability and documentation of who people have said they are, how do we actually authenticate those documents? So it can go into some very interesting diplomatic-y directions too. Okay. Yes, thank you for that comment. Okay, who else has questions? Feel free to unmute. Comments, items that you've come with, help that you need.
I have a question.
Hi, Lily. Yes.
Hi, Sarah. So I was wondering, because I work in both museum studies and archival studies, and I was wondering if you discovered a very big difference between the way museum folks define provenance and the way archivists do, because I sometimes have a hard time talking between these two groups.
Ah, wonderful question. We are in search of answers like that in this project. Quickly, I can say that for museums tend to approach items on a more, frankly, item level. So they are definitely concerned with placing an item into an art historical context. Who made the item? What were the sources of their paint? You know, to the level of where did the ink come from and the pigments, as we have seen in some very interesting scientific analyses of paintings, where they try to source the materials that are actually in the painting down to the trees that gave the ink, that gave the canvas, etc. So I think in general, what I'm saying is that museums look at provenance at an item level, and it's reflected in the way they catalog. And the one example from the Rural History Collection, for example, shows item by item, photographing each item and trying to replicate the same kinds of descriptive fields for each item, even if a lot of the information might be inherited across a set of 5 items that share a provenance. But it is important, I think, in the museum space that they provide that item photograph so that the scholars who are interested in the beauty and the uniqueness of an item can look at that item as a unique and solitary object. And that's not often the same in archives, where for reasons of the format and the kinds of collections that enter into archives versus those that enter into museums, archivists tend to take a higher level approach and only rarely get to go to the item level. In fact, archivists tend to work at broader collection levels and even series and subgroups perhaps, but often don't get to drill down into the item level, even though we know that researchers want digitized pages from those collections. But that is certainly an ongoing challenge, to provide access to every single page in a 500-page collection, all of the board minutes and all of the annual reports. To digitize all of those gets at the item level that is common to museums, but it also forgets perhaps that these items are part of a larger collection with a unique provenance. Great question. There's clearly much more to discuss there. I see Pat has a question. Checking to the website. Here's the website. So I'd love to hear if anybody has a Knotty collection that has caused them maybe not even any time because you haven't known what to do with it yet. I'd love if anybody wants to share.
So not about our own collection, but I was wondering if you guys had more examples from your research of like projects that you've tackled or resolved, I suppose.
Sure. There are a lot of examples out there. And I think Jane, in the example that she showed, really demonstrated that we can learn a lot from different kinds of examples, and the future results or answers that that kind of research has made possible. So more examples, I would say, are in the works in terms of putting together example from all of the different sections that we're looking at. But we hope today to really focus on two key ones in some level of detail. And those are the two that I think we can detail a little bit more for you now to help you out with this question. Jane, perhaps you'd like to show a little bit more about the example that you looked at, where we saw that by tracing the path that the painting in this case took from Dresden to Brazil, we learned a little bit about the painting's history. Jane?
Yep, I'm going to share my screen again because I clicked a button and then everything got mashed up. But
Those
let
buttons.
me share my screen again. All right, so back to this example, I actually wrote down all of the path of this one. Just because I thought it was so interesting. Like I had mentioned before, it started, I guess the origin is in 1919 in Germany. So the Dresden Museum, City Museum acquired it. Then in July of 1937, to what they list as unknown, it was officially seized by the Nazis. And then from 1938 to, again, they list as unknown, that work actually traveled in what is called a degenerate art exhibition. So it's essentially like a traveling like sideshow for these pieces of art that they've seized. And they have paperwork that indicates that it was actually placed in a storage depot in Germany. And then after the war, there's documentation that the painting ended up in the basement of a Nazi official, and it wasn't discovered until French forces were in the area after the war. So after the war until 1958, like I had mentioned, the French found it, and they actually auctioned it off to fund German war reparations, and it was bought by a Hungarian art dealer. So once that Hungarian art dealer had the painting, he actually reached out to Segal and his family to confirm that authenticity. And in 1958 until now, so its final resting place as of right now, a year after Segal's death, the Hungarian art dealer actually charged his widow $1,000 to buy back that painting to then be able to have in what they have is in Sao Paulo is a museum devoted to Segal, and it's actually was his home that they converted into a museum. So that's where it stands now. But it's interesting that you could prove it's authentic. You could prove that the Segal family owned it, but they still had to purchase it.
That reveals, Chloe, I think, who asked the question, it reveals that story that Jane has just recapped for us. It reveals a lot of the historical flashpoints that can be part of the object story that are not always captured in documentation, but we have to find the documentation connecting to the second example, in fact, we have to find the documentation from other and unexpected places and bring it into the object story for multiple purposes. Was that useful?
Yeah, that was really fascinating. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dina Bennett. I just have a comment. So I see that Sakal died in 1957. So I guess he died without knowing or seeing the painting come back to his museum.
He
died in
did.
1957. Yeah.
Unfortunately, he knew that it existed because the
Mhm.
Hungarian art dealer had contacted him to say, is this your work? But it wasn't sold to his widow, unfortunately, till after his death.
Okay. Thank you. Fascinating.
And Chloe, this was just one story. So part of our interest in hearing from you all today is that we know that there are other stories to be told yet in the collections that for various reasons haven't been displayed because of issues of provenance that are confused and knotty and uncovered, unrevealed. So I think by hearing about the success stories or the examples that we've shared that have been illustrated in very different ways, it's useful because we can take a little bit of that knowledge into our own situations, like in your collection case.
I think that that is interesting. It kind of reminds me of an undergraduate project that I did. So I actually attended Stevens College. I worked with Dr. James Terry there, and we would also work with the Mizzou collections as well. But I recall a specific project that really meant a lot to me was when I got to speak with some of the curators in one of the art museums and check out the provenance that they had for some pieces. And that was really fascinating, just, to see that great documentation that, not every museum has always had, I suppose. It's pretty cool.
That was great, Chloe. Thank you. Did your curator or individuals there indicate how they would use the information that you found out? Would it inform their labels or their online catalog or other tools?
To my knowledge, there was a decent amount of information that was kind of just kept in the folder because it could have, caused some issues. But then there was some information. The exhibit label, I recall, was pretty minimal. So we had to do like some online research. And then I also ended up reaching out to some of the curators there. And I think I was the only one that did that, just to, see what information they had. But it was really interesting because it was a piece that had gone through some Nazi hands at one point. It's just so fascinating to me. I really like provenance.
Love that. We do too. And we hope that we've shown how it can affect multiple objects, even those that might not have a World War II history, because they might have been acquired a century ago, or even much more recently, for example, in a donation in the case of somebody leaving their estate or in their will, for leaving a large collection, for example, to different institutions that we've encountered. Other questions or comments? There are no bad questions. Happy to shed a little more light on anything that was confusing or caught your attention to.
Something that we deal with a lot. I'm in a science museum, so we have large archaeology collections. Is we have several from when our museum was first formed, and we were just kind of taking whatever people would offer us. We have several archaeology collections that just say the donor, and then it will list 500 archaeology objects. And so we don't have any idea where the person collected them from, or if they collected them from somebody else, or over what span of time. And so we just have these large archaeological collections of stone points and pottery that have absolutely no information. We have no idea what to do with those.
Oh, Caitlin, gosh, thank you for mentioning that, because it reminds me that another word that perhaps you've encountered is provenience. Does that ring a bell?
Oh yes, all the time. And so we have also several provenience issues of material that was collected, and we know we have like detailed lists, but just no sites. And then with the provenance issue, several of those collections we know have changed hands, but we don't know who they changed hands from. And so the one I'm thinking about in particular, the main donor collected from, we know he said he collected from multiple other people. We just don't know who those people are.
That is so interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because it gets at, I think, the issue that we've seen in some writing about Native American artifacts, where the collections, and this is relevant because in America, a lot of our archaeology has happened on Native American sites, right? So the collections sometimes are described in our access mechanisms under the name of the excavator, the researcher who went to the site, and they become the XYZ collection of photographs. But it elides, that kind of description elides and forgets the names of the tribes and the names of the individuals who perhaps were the owners of the materials that are now in that collection. So part of the work now is to do this work of uncovering the names of the people represented in the collections. And we're even looking at issues of renaming and reparative description, trying to surface those names and maybe rename, or at least give those names the same level of provenance, that the names of the collectors have accrued. It's definitely a fascinating issue. So the item of provenience, obviously I didn't focus too much on the new word of provenience, but as you know, it has a more specific meaning of a particular spot in place and time. So just as Jane was showing the map of path that the painting has gone through over the years, provenience is similarly oriented around plotting on a map exactly where an object came from. And provenience is just a more specific item that refers to the exact, latitude and longitude level of information of where an object in archaeology came out of the ground. So it's definitely a related concept to provenance, more relevant for those archaeological or heritage collections. And in the case of your example, which is a collection of Clovis points, or as I think you said, arrowheads, items that were all from a general location, but maybe we did not gather that level of provenience for each single one. yes, this is a prime candidate, for doing this kind of work. And if it's important to know this level of detail, we have to go back through the original field notebooks, right? I'm sure you've thought about or encountered doing that at some level.
Yeah, and that's one of the unfortunate things, is where we inherited some of these from the anthropology department. I'm on a university campus, and so we're the museum, and then there's the anthropology department, and nobody knows where those notebooks are. And we've checked archives and the libraries and everywhere else, and we're completely lost. We have no idea where they ended up.
Yes, you're not alone. I will say that this is an issue that occurs with multiple fields that rely on contingent and project time spans, where you assemble a team for a certain amount of time and then people disperse from the project. And sometimes their documentation stays with the project and other times it stays with the person. In the case where it stays with the person, they will hold on to it as long as they want to. And then unfortunately, we sometimes deal with a lot of loss in archives. And this was a more underlying issue that perhaps we didn't get to discuss overall. But I think archives are constantly wrestling with what do we have and what do we not have? How do we represent the items that we don't have? Can we speak for them at all? Can we involve artists perhaps to create new and speculative artifacts to take the place of what was lost? So there are certainly some very interesting solutions coming out for how to answer this very challenging issue. We can definitely involve our collaborators in answering these too. It shouldn't all be on the collections managers. Great comments, everybody. Thank you.
We have, oh, sorry, I heard myself like, can you, I have someone else on the call in here in the office and I started to hear myself echoing, but we have a somewhat similar but also different kind of issue that we run into in our collection, where a lot of times we're not a science museum, we're a history, a jazz museum. And a lot of times in like the early days of the museum, for whatever reason, if a donor wanted to be anonymous, instead of recording their information, they would put donor anonymous. And so then we don't really have any way of figuring out who gave us these things in the first place. So that's been an issue that I've run into with, like, how do you try to even start to learn where an object came from if you don't even have like that first step to start looking?
Oh, exactly. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, Morgan. It kind of came up when we said, go visit your own galleries, see what you're saying about the items, because usually the gallery labels are written by a different individual than was doing the catalog. Our museums have very long time spans, and the documentation sometimes comes from different sources. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because often we're finding that it all starts with a name, but we can't create documentation where it doesn't exist. And for the unfortunate cases where people have done that, that gets people into problems when it turns out that the documentation has been faked or forged in order to drive up the price for selling the object at auction. So we do see that people are recognizing the gap and the absence of information and they will take steps to try to fill it in. But it's important, we will say, from our discussion of ethics today, to not put information that is not true, because it does tend to catch up with either the museum much later down the road when the people are no longer involved, but it's the museum that's responsible, or it could catch up with the individual, as we saw in the 1990s. So advice, what can I offer? So I would say to keep plugging away. I'm thinking back to one of my interviewees, and they took a long time to get to know their collection. They were brand new into their position, and it's something that I inform and talk about in my classes too. It can take some time to get to know your collection, but keep a journal and keep a note and keep a running commentary sometimes on information that you're finding. Sometimes it's misfiled, or it's in a different holdings folder, or it's out with the registrar and it's not in your everyday workspace, but it's out in a different department. Or maybe the marketing team wrote up a paragraph and that has a name in it that can help you out, get you started. And then, as Jane was saying, it sometimes starts with art history resources, like there are resources for cuneiform and there are resources for rare books. And as we go further along in the project, our website will start to show some of those resources. Like I said, that's the ongoing work that we're involved with right now. But so for different categories, there are some resources available. And then also the big one is to do genealogical research. And for those, we will talk at a future time about once you have a name, you can do genealogical resources, use your genealogical resources out there to investigate those names and try to source what they might have had a role in related to the object. Does that help a little?
Yeah, that is actually helpful because one of the things that I didn't actually think about looking towards is some old information for our collections committees, because sometimes they will put extra information in like their meeting minutes that they don't put elsewhere. So that might actually be a good place to look.
Yeah, that's the problem with this, with provenance, is that it comes from so many different sources, and without attention given to provenance as an important issue up until now, when of course I think things are improving, but there's still a ways to go. Unfortunately, we're still encountering the situation of the information is so scattered, it's in different places, and it hasn't been called what it needs to be, that this is your source of value and your source of authenticity. And it will ultimately help your collection for insurance purposes, if you know, economic are what's driving the work. So there's different reasons that the information is important. And I hope that we have been able to share a few of those with you today. I'm looking at the time and I see that we've had a very great and rich discussion as intended with this Mamma Colleague conversation. So let me thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your questions and ideas that you've shared with us today. There will be another one of these in the next month of March, so please stay tuned for that. Thank you all for being here, and feel free to contact me, check out the website.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.